Okay, making this video is kind of impulsive. So, my thought process. Earlier in the summer, I thrifted this pattern. It is from 1981. It is a ridiculous, ruffly, fluffy shirt, and I made a test version of it last week out of just several different odds and ends of fabric remnants I have. And it turned out ridiculous, and I liked it so much I decided to make a skirt for it specifically. So I used this vintage pattern and I made a nice simple skirt to go with the ridiculous shirt, and I pranced around in it for a while. And then I realized there was enough fabric left from making the skirt to make probably a sort of more refined and structured vest. So I used this pattern. I made this view with, I don't know if you can see because the way it's illustrated, there's like a lapel and it has some princess seaming, so it's a very structured vest. And so I made that to go with the skirt. But making a vest made me think about how when I was in high school in the early 90s, I lived in tapestry vests. So I was thinking, I have several pieces of that particular kind of jacquarded fabric that has that tapestry look. And I have this 1990 vest pattern. So what if I just made one of those vests now and brought you along with me while I did it? So first thing I'm going to do is get into the fabric stash and pull out all of my potentially suitable tapestry fabrics. Alright, it's kind of a mess. Let's see if I can figure out how to decide. This, actually, no, I did use this in the 90s. I made a high-waisted pencil skirt. I mean, in this green color, can you think of anything more 90s? I have apparently made something from this, but I don't remember what. It has some, yeah, this must have been a mill-end type place because it has damage and discolorations in it. I had this tapestry vest in high school. It was colors of green and ivory and sort of a floral pattern. So yeah, so this would be in homage to a vest that I had 30 years ago. Alright, there's this one, which is somewhere between the kind of weight I'm thinking of for a vest and cheer gray. Wow, there's a lot of this. Yeah, I don't think I'll use this one just because there's so much of it. I mean, this one is a strong possibility. It is obnoxious. A vest would use most of it, which is a plus. I prefer to use projects where I use up the fabric I'm using. This one, this fabric is perfect for what I would want to use it for. It's the right weight, texture, appearance. There's a lot of it. And there would be a lot of it left after I made a vest. Still, that one is tempting. And then this one, which is caught on the price tag of another one, would be perfect, but it is several inches too short. I think I could still make it work if I wanted to mess around with things, but I don't feel like messing around with it that much at this point. So it comes down to this one that would be aesthetically in line versus this one that I would use most of the fabric, and honestly, teenage me would have worn something this bright and obnoxious. So yeah, I really think I'm gonna go with this one. Alright.
Okay, so I ended up picking out this fabric for the lining, which is actually the same fabric I used for the vest I just made. So one of the reasons I wanted to try making videos is because I want to show the things that I, as someone who's been sewing for a long time, I might do that people who maybe have not been sewing for so long might not do, might not have tried, might not know about, and just, show the things that could be weird quirks of my sewing, but I feel like they could be useful. And right now I'm trying to tell which end is up on this fabric, and also how frequently the design motif repeats, and it's pretty frequently, so I'm not going to be able to avoid having it repeat on the front of this vest. And I think that's up. Okay, so another quirk of the way that I treat patterns is in a multi-size pattern, I will cut out the largest size, and then when I need to cut the fabric, I'll just sort of choose the lines I need and make a mess out of cutting them out, but it works out. And another thing I do is I almost never pin my fabric. I use pattern weights. Well, I use scissors for pattern weights. I do have some actual pattern weights I made, but I prefer the way the scissors will weigh down longer areas. And yeah, okay, time to start cutting. So now that I've cut the whole piece out, it's time to start transferring the marks to the darts. So my work surface here is a big piece of cardboard covered with contact paper on an ironing board. I like it because it's standing height, so I don't have to crawl around the floor. And because it's cardboard, I can jam a straight pin right down into it. So that helps me to mark the darts because it can hold all the layers in place when I fold it open like this and then use the tailor's chalk to rub the marks onto the areas where the straight pins are. It is tedious, and actually this is only part 1 of how I make darts. The other part is coming up as soon as I get finished with this. So what I do is I open these up, I get a ruler, and I start connecting the dots. And what this does is it creates straight lines that I will be able to sew on instead of just starting at a dot and aiming for another dot and hoping that I actually sew a straight line. My darts have gotten so much better since I've started doing this. Alright, now it's time to cut out the lining, and I'm not actually using the tissue pattern piece, I'm using the piece of the front that I cut already to cut the lining pieces. And now it's time to transfer the dots and mark the darts again. And once I have finished drawing the darts on this, it's time to do it over and over and over again for all the other lining pieces. And now it's time for interfacing. Interfacing is the kind of thing that I think a lot of people new to sewing think interfacing is pointless, but it is not pointless. The purpose of interfacing is to reinforce edges. It gives them a little more body and durability, and in this case, for buttons, it gives it a lot more strength. A lot of people don't like cutting interfacing. Some people do. Some people enjoy the tactile sensation of cutting through the interfacing itself. But most people agree that cutting interfacing just feels like doing the same thing over and over and over. It is annoying, but it does serve a purpose. helps clothes hang better, it helps stabilize things, gives them durability. And in this case, I am adding interfacing to something that's already kind of a heavy fabric, which seems weird, but buttons. You need to interface anywhere there are working buttons. So I got that done, and it's time to iron the iron-on interfacing to the backside of the fabric. And I quickly tack it on with mess it up. Take it off because it's just tacked. Quickly tack it on to the back of the fabric and then flip it over to right side up and press it with a little more enthusiasm. Now it's time to sew the dart. Sew both darts in the front. Sewing along those nice lines I drew, and then repeat it again for the front lining. Now the back lining actually has, or the not back lining, the back outside has the back ties sewn into the darts. So I need to sew the back ties, and as you can see I have put my magnetic seam guide on my sewing machine needle plate, and this seam guide is something fairly new to my repertoire of sewing gadgets, and I love it. It means I can sew the seams without constantly stopping to double check that I am lining up with the right little grooved line in the sewing machine needle plate. So I highly recommend that. Alright, now it's time to sew the remaining darts. Now time to press all the darts. I press quickly from the back to make sure the darts are going in the correct direction. And then I flip it over and press more thoroughly from the outside. Especially since it's curved, there are little things that you have to really flatten out to press. Now I did discover the hard way that fabric melts under my highest iron heat setting. So it is not quite at the highest heat setting, and I thought about increasing the heat setting for this, but it is also synthetic. So I kept it at the next highest heat setting, and it did end up pressing nicely after all. Now I am sewing the shoulders. You see I have my magnetic seam gauge depth guide thingy back in place. So I use that when I'm sewing the shoulders together for the outside and for the lining. And then once those are together, it is time to sew all the edges. The arm openings, the lower back edge. Right now I'm sewing the lower front edge that turns into the front opening that turns into the neckline that goes around and comes back down. And something that I recently realized about my sewing machine is that the front of the needle plate right here is 5/8 inches from my sewing machine needle. So when it's time to turn a corner like this, I just stop when I can see the edge of that needle plate and turn it, and with that magnetic seam guide in place, I just go without thinking about anything else again. Now it's time to clip corners. Something else I'm not sure if people new to sewing understand is that you really need to get rid of a lot of the seam allowance on the inside of corners, like the outer corners of the vest here, or on collar points. You can't cut too close or else it will fall apart when you turn it right side out, so it does take a while to get a hang of how much to cut off so that there's no bulk inside, but there's enough fabric left that it doesn't fall apart. So I am clipping those corners here. And then another thing that I think some people new to sewing might not know is that whenever you have a concave curve, such as the front of this vest opening and definitely around the neckline, you need to clip into the seam allowance. You clip too close to, but not through your stitching. If you don't do this, then when you turn it right side out, suddenly your seam allowance is shorter than the curve geometry, and it's just something that you need to do. Now it's time to turn things right side out. So I get it started enough that I can then take a dowel rod and push it through the shoulder seams and then out the side of the back. And it's always fiddly to do this because there's always a point where you wonder if you have too much fabric and it's not going to fit through at all. But you eventually keep working with it, and it rewards you with turning right side out. And I did that for the other side, and then pressing. I have this thing, it's called a Dritz Easy Hem. It's a stainless steel piece that has rulers printed on it so that when you're pressing up a hem, you can get an even depth of pressing. But I'm using it here just so I can have a nice straight edge inside the vest that I can press against with the iron. Unfortunately, because it's metal, it does cause a lot of condensation from the steam iron, but that will dry out when you press it enough. So I press every straight edge that I can possibly get this thing into with it. That keeps my fingers away from the edges and gives me a nice straight pressed edge. Unfortunately, I have no tools like this to use with the curved edges, so I have to do those a little more freehand and keep my fingers out of the way. Alright, now to sew the side, the first side seams, I pin it just so it will stay in place, and then I pull it all the way through to the other side, out to the other side. Then I line up the top and bottom seams with a pin, and actually this is, I believe, how the pattern tells you to do it. I did not follow the directions. But once you get everything pinned in place, you're going to sew all around these as sort of a tube. I feel like this is the kind of thing that might not make sense if you haven't done it before, but I have done it before and I like it because it is nice, secure. I can do it entirely with the machine and not have to do any hand stitching of the lining. It's awkward. Okay, and as you see, I'm pulling it right side out, and it is nice and stitched and clean. Unfortunately, the other side is not as straightforward. You can't pull it through. You have to do the same stitch you just did as much as possible from the outside, but because it's from the outside, you can't go all the way around, and I mean, you can't see what I'm doing here, but it wouldn't be helpful anyway. It fights you the whole time, and it gets even worse when you're sewing because there's the bulk of the fabric that can't be turned inside out because you have to sew around it, and I still persist in doing this because it leaves the smallest amount of hand stitching when I'm done, but it is annoying. And then when I turn it right side out, there's still this little bit that couldn't be sewn here. It's going to have to be slip stitch closed, but for me that is an acceptable amount of hand stitching. Have I mentioned I don't like hand stitching? Because I don't. And on the outside it looks fine. Now, I'm going to do some edge stitching. The pattern does not call for edge stitching, but if you know me and my sewing proclivities, I will edge stitch and top stitch whenever possible. I like to use my straight stitch foot. I align the edge of what I'm sewing with the inside of the right prong of the straight stitch foot, and that gives me a stitch that is fairly close to the edge and fairly even. Just don't look too closely at my curves and it'll be fine. Okay, buttons. It's probably a bad habit of not picking my buttons out until it's time to put the buttons on. I trust my button stash enough that I can usually find something, and I first thought I would use elaborate metallic buttons on this, like my vest in the 90s tended to have, but when I opened this, I immediately saw these fake horn buttons in a golden yellow color that really matched the vest well, so I decided to go with those instead of metallic. After all, it comes time to position the buttons. What I did is I laid them out roughly on the vest, and then I got another sewing gadget. That is the Simflex expandable sewing gauge. Ta-da! So what this does is it expands and it keeps the fingers enough of an equidistance from each other that it's fine if you don't get in with the millimeter measuring. So I expand it to roughly the size of where the buttons should be, and then I align it so that any marks I make will be roughly the same distance from the edge. Then I get my chalk and make marks. Now it's time to get the buttonholer set up. My sewing machine does not make great automatic buttonhole stitches, so I use this old buttonholer attachment. Right now I am picking out the can that is just slightly larger than the buttons because you need to make a larger buttonhole than your buttons so there is room for the button to go through. You should always store your buttonholers with a can in it, so I keep the largest can in normally, and now I'm putting in the can that I'm going to actually use. When it comes to putting it on the sewing machine, oh, drop your feet, dogs. When it comes to putting on the sewing machine, if you're not already left-handed or ambidextrous, it will just really help if you become so, because it is really awkward to reach your right hand around to put that screw on. And sewing has made me more ambidextrous than that summer I tried writing with my left hand. So I set the zigzag to a very narrow depth or width, and then align the edge of the vest with the back edge of the buttonholer foot, and then I usually go around 3 times on normal sewing, so I go around 4 times on this one just to make it a little sturdier because the cloth is heavier. The buttonholer guides it around and around. All I'm doing with my hands is stabilizing it. And then repeat that 2 more times. Trim everything. And then I actually tried as an experiment for the first time putting some fray check on the buttonholes front and back in hopes of keeping the threads in check once it's cut. It worked fine on the back, not so much in the front. I probably should have put more fray check on, but learning experience. Now it's time to cut the buttonholes open, and I get out my craft blade with a square-ended X-Acto. My craft knife with a square-ended X-Acto blade in it. And to make the cuts, I carefully line this up with the center of the buttonhole, avoiding the stitching I just did, and press down so it crunches through all layers of fabric and interfacing. And it takes a few times to get the whole buttonhole cut this way, but I feel like for me it is the least likely to slip and make a huge cut where there should not be a huge cut. And then I run it back and forth just to make sure it's cut all the way through, and repeat for the other button. Now to mark where the buttons go, I aligned the points of the vest with the edge of my sewing table, overlapped the buttonholes over the other side, and then used a sharp sewing pencil to mark through the buttonholes onto the overlap. Now, explaining how to sew a button on with the sewing machine, I'm not sure I can do it quickly. You line things up, lower the needle, remember that it should not be set on zigzag, set that back to straight, stitch it a few times in place to form a kind of a knot, set it on zigzag, a pretty wider zigzag than you think, because the next thing you're going to do is insert a heavy needle into a groove on the presser foot that holds the button in place, and hand crank to make sure that your zigzag is wide enough to miss that needle and to land in the other hole, and zigzag stitch a few times. Then this is a 4-hole button, so I move things and repeat that for the other side, making sure that it's not going to hit anything that it shouldn't hit, because that is how needles break. Ask me how I know. Take the needle out, put the zigzag back to straight, lower the presser foot, and zigzag stitch in place several times. And then leave the thread tails long because you're going to take them behind the button. Not through the fabric yet, you're taking them to the back of the button. And then you're going to wrap them around those threads several times. The reason for that heavy needle and for this wrapping is to make a shank for the button, because since the button goes through fabric, you need to leave enough room for that fabric under the button. Then thread the thread tails through a needle, and now you can bring them to the back, tie them off, repeat for all the buttons, and then I again tried hitting them with some freight check afterwards, and it is done. Really.